Hey guys, Jonathan here with TLD. Thank you guys very much for your patience. I am back with the much requested and highly anticipated performance comparison showdown against the last generation Ivy Bridge base 15-inch baseline Retina MacBook Pro, which features NVIDIA GT650M graphics, against the new late 2013 model that's based off Haswell and features only Iris Pro graphics. And like I talked about in my mini rant video, as disappointed as I was with the lack of dedicated graphics on the new baseline 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro, I was going to keep an open mind and really not put it aside and kick it to the curb until I really put the two side by side, tested them out, and see how they stacked up against each other. So with that said, I spent the entire weekend testing these two models, and I'm proud to give you guys a really in-depth and thorough comparison, because anybody and their mother can give a Geekbench score or a disk speed test, and synthetic benchmarks, they're great and they kind of give an initial impression, but they don't really paint the entire picture, and you guys will see that with this video. So with that said, before we actually jump in, I will say that Iris Pro actually surprised me in certain aspects. It was what I expected in other aspects, but overall, I'm really happy I did this because I have a really clear and concise analysis of these two models, and I think you guys are going to enjoy it. So without any further ado, I know you guys are excited. If you guys are feeling like being awesome and want to hit that like button for a weekend full of testing, it is greatly appreciated, and let's go. So first up is Geekbench 3, the 64-bit edition. We have both single core and multi-core scores, and as you can see, the Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro slightly outperforms the Haswell-based MacBook Pro, but I want you guys to keep these numbers in the back of your head because this is a good example of where benchmark programs, they give a really good assessment of overall performance, but they don't tell you absolutely everything. Next up is Cinebench, the new R15 benchmark. This is the CPU portion. It's measured in CB points, which essentially means the higher the score, the better. The Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro again slightly outperformed with a score of 572 versus 564 on the Haswell-based MacBook Pro, but again, keep those numbers in the back of your head. Following that is Luxmark 2.1. This is an OpenCL benchmark. I tested it with the GPU only, the CPU plus the GPU, and also added HD 4000 integrated graphics as a reference point. Now, interestingly enough, this really shows how poor NVIDIA-based cards performed with OpenCL performance. You can see even the old HD 4000 graphics outperformed the 650M in terms of OpenCL. The GTX 650M by itself pumped out a score of 144K rays per second as opposed to the 460 on the Iris Pro graphics, so that was a huge difference there. But if you actually combine both the CPU and the GPU together, you can see the performance difference wasn't that drastic, but regardless, Iris Pro outperformed the Ivy Bridge model on this particular test. Next up is Ocean Wave 1.6.1. This is an OpenCL test again, and they scored exactly the same, so it doesn't really tell us a whole lot. So for now, we're going to kind of throw this test out the window, but I do want to keep it for reference for when I test the GT750M, and then we can come back and compare those scores against these. So definitely stay tuned and subscribe if you don't want to miss that. Next up, we got Unigine Valley 1.0, which translates over to gaming performance, and as expected, you can see the GT650M just about doubles the performance of Iris Pro, so there was definitely a performance hit in terms of gaming between these two models. Jumping back over to Cinebench R15, the OpenGL side of things, and this is based off Cinema 4D, so if you do plan on doing anything like that, this will give you a good idea of how these two perform. Now again, here with the lack of dedicated GPU, you can see there is a performance hit on the Iris Pro MacBook Pro with a score of 42.9 on Ivy Bridge and a score of 27.3 average frames per second on Haswell. Next up, in one more gaming test, this is Dirt 2 at high settings. I ran this both at 1680 by 1050 and 2880 by 1800, which is actually higher than HD. And again, you can clearly see in terms of actual gaming performance, the Iris Pro MacBook Pro just simply could not keep up with the Ivy Bridge model, which features the GT650M processor. Now, if you were not aware, the new Haswell-based MacBook Pros feature PCI Express flash storage, so that eliminates any SATA bottleneck and results in much faster performance. So on the read side of things, the Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro pumped out a score of 419 megabytes per second, whereas Haswell jumped over 200 megabytes per second with a score of 676.2. Again, we saw the exact same thing with write speeds. The Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro was just under 450 megabytes per second, whereas the Haswell MacBook Pro was an astonishing 730 megabytes per second, so a huge difference there. Now, of course, those numbers sound impressive, but in terms of how they actually translate into real-world performance, what I did next was I duplicated a 10.5 gigabyte file, and as you can see, the PCI Express flash storage on the Haswell MacBook Pro completely smashed the performance on the Ivy Bridge model, duplicating a 10.gigabyte file in under 30 seconds. Next up is the Driver Heaven Photoshop Bench version 3.0. I'm using Photoshop CC for reference. Now, this is actually a series of various tests within Photoshop. It's a free download, and if you're curious to see exactly what goes on or you want to compare your results with mine, I'll post a link of that down below. With that said, you can see these two perform just just about the same in terms of Photoshop. The Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro slightly outperformed the Haswell model, but there really wasn't a huge difference between the two. Jumping over to Aperture 3.5, I took 10 raw photos, and by the way, Big Mac and Melody say hi. And what I did was convert those to JPEG at half their size, and as you can see again, they perform just about the same on both Ivy Bridge and Haswell. Hopping over to Handbrake 64-bit, what I did was take a 1-minute MKV file and transcoded it into a high-profile H.264 preset, and as you can see, the Haswell MacBook Pro actually outperformed it by about 5 seconds. Next up is the latest iMovie, which is 64-bit now, and I will say it is extremely fast. So if you guys haven't checked it out, you may want to do so because it is pretty speedy. Again, here the Haswell MacBook Pro outperforms the Ivy Bridge model by about 7 seconds, which does definitely add up over time. Moving on to Final Cut Pro 10, which is my editing software of choice. What I did was took a 7-second clip, 1080p H.264, applied a 50% retime, then applied stabilization, and then applied optical flow. And this is actually pretty taxing. Now, much to my surprise, the Haswell-based Iris Pro MacBook Pro completely obliterated the GTX 650M Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro, and I actually ran this test multiple times just to make sure, but again and again, it clearly outperformed the previous generation. Next, I applied a blur effect to a 45-second 1080p clip, and here, the Ivy Bridge model actually outperforms. So you can see in these couple of tests, they're exchanging blows back and forth. Jumping over to my last set of Final Cut Pro 10 tests, on a 3-minute 1080p H.264 export, the Haswell MacBook Pro actually outperformed the Ivy Bridge by quite a bit. The overall export took 4 minutes and 13 seconds on Ivy Bridge, whereas the same exact task on Haswell took 3 minutes and 43 seconds, which is definitely impressive. Now conversely, on a 3-minute 1080p optimized to ProRes transcode, you can see the 650M Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro actually outperformed the Haswell model, but overall in terms of Final Cut Pro 10 performance, I think I would go with the Haswell model. On to After Effects CC, I ran 2 different tests. One was a 7-second warp stabilize test and a 10-second track camera test. Now on both of those tests, the Haswell MacBook Pro outperformed the Ivy Bridge model, and again, I ran these multiple times to make sure they were right. Now, even though those numbers seem impressive, do note that there is 0 video card support with Iris Pro and After Effects, and you need a dedicated video card with CUDA to do that. So for example, a 3D benchmark that I was able to run on both my iMac and the 650M MacBook Pro, I wasn't able to run at all on the Iris Pro MacBook Pro because there was no support at all. So just keep that in mind if you do plan on doing heavy 3D work. Next up is Premiere Pro CC. I also ran a warp stabilize test, the same 7-second clip that I ran in After Effects, which I also included for reference because if you notice, there is actually OpenCL acceleration support for the new Iris Pro in Premiere Pro CC. So if you notice, that same task that we did in After Effects took a lot longer as opposed to Premiere Pro. And even with all that in mind, the new Haswell MacBook Pro outperformed the Ivy Bridge model in this series of tests. Jumping to my last Premiere Pro test, what I did was take that same 3-minute project that I did in Final Cut Pro 10, exported it, and as you can see again, Haswell clearly outperforms Ivy Bridge with a total time of 4 minutes and 57 seconds, whereas Ivy Bridge took 5 minutes and 34 seconds. So there was definitely a noticeable difference there. Closing out my set of tests, and this is something that I feel a lot of people overlook, and that is the actual temperature of how these MacBook Pros operate. So with a light load, just basic Safari browsing, the Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro was about 49 degrees Celsius, whereas the Haswell MacBook Pro was actually about 5 degrees cooler at 44 degrees Celsius. Now actually ramping things up and putting these things through its paces at a heavy load with a Final Cut Pro 10 export, the Ivy Bridge MacBook Pro was about 93 degrees Celsius, whereas Haswell was considerably cooler at 85 degrees Celsius. So as you can see, these new MacBook Pros do run quite a bit cooler. So that wraps up the performance comparison between those two models. Hopefully I covered a diverse enough array of applications to help with your buying decision. And to get one thing right out of the way, if you own the previous generation Ivy Bridge 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro, there is absolutely no reason to upgrade to the current baseline model. The performance gains were applicable, aren't really enough to justify an upgrade. You do take a slight hit on gaming, and overall just that performance and a little bit better battery life isn't enough to actually go sell it and then upgrade to this model. You definitely want to wait till next year's 2014 version, which will be based off Intel's Broadwell platform. Overall, I was definitely impressed with Iris Pro as a whole. It definitely exceeded my expectations. Pretty much in every media-based application, it performed on par, if not better. As you saw with Photoshop, it was about the same, but in Final Cut Pro 10 and Premiere Pro, it actually performed a little faster on those exports. So as we saw, there was a definite definite hit on gaming performance with the Iris Pro graphics, so if that does matter to you, you may want to consider the previous generation refurbished models or step up to the $2599 model, which features the GT750M. Now, on that same hand, if you plan on being a heavy After Effects user or using Cinema 4D as we saw with Cinebench, or even Maya for that matter, you definitely want to look towards a dedicated GPU. So that could either be the refurbished previous gen models, which you can actually get a lot for your money. I'll have links to those down below, or step up again to the $2599 GT750M. Now, with all that said, if you don't really care about gaming or plan on doing any heavy 3D work, then the new 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro baseline based off Haswell is actually a pretty solid purchase. So you can do basic After Effects tasks, and for the most part, in terms of actual media performance, the Iris Pro outperforms the previous generation MacBook Pro. Plus, you get a better battery life, and it runs cooler like we talked about. Now, if that is the case and you do plan on purchasing one of these new MacBook Pros, I will have an Amazon link down below where you can actually save tax. Most states don't pay sales tax, so you could save up to a couple $100 depending on the model that you pick up. If you guys enjoy the content that I put out and you guys appreciate the time that goes into these videos, if you guys use that link, a little bit goes back to the channel and helps me make videos like these ones. Now, conversely, after watching this video and you decide you need a dedicated video card but don't necessarily want to jump up to the $2,600 model, then you probably want to check out the refurbished MacBook Pros, which will be linked down below. Unlike Amazon, I do not get credit for those refurbished links, but you can possibly save a few $100s, and I want you guys to get what suits you best and make the best possible buying decision. Now, lastly, if you just watch this video just to watch it and you have no intentions of buying a MacBook Pro, even if you use that Amazon link down below, whether it's socks or a pair of headphones or whatever it is, a little bit still goes back to the channel and allows me to put the time in needed to make these videos. Thank you guys very much for all your support. If you guys have any questions, whether it's buying advice, definitely leave me a line down below. I do try to reply to as many YouTube comments as possible, but like I talked about before, it does get a little bit messy. So the absolute best way to get a hold of me is on Twitter at TLD Today. That is linked down below. And I've also been recently using Google+, which is a pretty awesome place to have a discussion. It's a lot more personal than YouTube. There's less trolls, less spam. So if you guys want to have your question answered, there's a better community. So both Twitter and Google+ will be linked down below, and Facebook if that is your thing. Aside from that, thank you guys so much for the support, for your patience. I will be back testing out some more MacBook Pros. Definitely stay tuned for that. Again, this is Jonathan with TLD, and I will see you guys later.